My maternal grandfather, Daniel Carney Sr., was 58 when I was born in 1947. I was 18 when he died in 1965. By then, my only thought about him was that he was old. He'd been a plumber all of his life, and that kind of physical labor, done for decades, takes a toll. Plus, of course, Daniel drank. Mostly beer, and mostly on the weekends. At family functions, he'd be escorted to a cushioned chair and brought a glass of beer, which would be refilled whenever it was empty. And there he would stay in our ultra-modern 50s living room until the end of whatever the celebration was. Christmas, or a birthday, or a first communion. He didn't talk much, or even pay attention to what others were saying, except when local politics came up. That roused him. He would still seem slightly dazed, but would try, largely unsuccessfully, to force his emotions into arguments. Everyone would pause, listen to him, affirm whatever he said, and then continue with their conversations. What I remember most about Daniel were his thick eyebrows and gnarled hands. When I was around 5, Dan Sr. was more engaged. He would take me downtown Troy, New York, where he'd spent most of his life. We'd visit bars, or sit in the park and feed the pigeons roasted peanuts, which he bought from street vendors, all of whom knew his name. Though working class, Daniel was invariably dressed up, in a suit with a starched shirt, along with a vest and pocket watch. He looked clean and polished, in a way that only successful immigrants aspire to. No matter where we were or whom we were with, my grandfather always fussed over me, making sure I was comfortable and had something to eat or drink. And he would brag about me, his handsome, healthy grandson, Helen's son. He loved to rub my forehead. I never really understood why, but I liked it. By the time I reached my early teens, my grandfather's clarity had begun to fade. Still, we had a connection. We would watch the Friday night fights together. I don't quite understand why. He wasn't living with us. But still, I remember watching the fights every week with him. They made me feel tough and mature in ways that even then I think I knew I would never be. No one else in my family liked boxing, so my grandfather and I watched the bouts by ourselves, including the infamous Emil Griffith championship fight against Benny Kid Paret in 1962. At the weigh-in, Paret called Griffith a homosexual. It enraged Emil, who after being knocked down early, came on in the late rounds to pin Paret in the corner and land 24 consecutive shots to Paret's head. Eventually the kid slid to the mat. My grandfather said, "That boy will never fight again." And he didn't. Paret stayed in a coma for 10 days and then died. After Paret was carried off, Daniel got nostalgic and said that when he was a boy, there were boxing matches in Troy in an outside arena, and that he would get in free by carrying coal for the heaters in the stands to keep the fans warm. The image charmed me. The young, undoubtedly ragamuffin kid lugging coal to get to watch men box. It seemed a scene from so long ago, another world, yet one that, through Daniel, I felt I could sense with some accuracy. The more I researched, the more interested I became. Daniel was born in Ireland in 1889. I know nothing of his life there. His mother, Hannah, was 32 when she had him. Daniel was the 5th of her 7 children. When he was 8, Hannah brought him and his 6 siblings and 1 nephew, also named Dan, from Ireland to Troy. They arrived at Ellis Island on June 17, 1897, 2 days after a massive fire burnt down everything on the island. At makeshift outdoor facilities, my great-grandmother registered Troy as their destination, which would imply they knew someone there. No one from my grandfather's, or even from my mother's generation, is still alive, so I can't find out more about Daniel personally. I focus instead on his times, and then have imagined what it must have been like for him to be alive during those times. Researching Troy itself has been a total revelation. Growing up, I'd only known the city in decay. In fact, Troy's history is dramatic, especially at the time of my grandfather's youth. Troy was brashly named after the legendary city of the Trojan Wars. Even bolder, Daniel named his third child, my mother, Helen, after the face whose beauty launched 1,000 ships. Troy was at the intersection of the Hudson and the Erie Canal, at the time when water was king and queen and chairman of the board in terms of transportation. Troy shipped New England produce to New York via the Hudson and used the Erie Canal and the Great Lakes to deliver to the Midwest whatever came into New York Harbor. And Troy was situated at a number of waterfalls which provided cheap power for mills. Sister City, Watervliet, became a mill town and the originator of the detachable collar. Troy became the fourth wealthiest city in the U.S. It had its own racetrack and baseball team, the Troy Haymakers. Adding spice, Troy was situated on the only road in or out of Vermont, and so was the first city freed of puritanical New England morals. Troy became a hot town, filled with bars and brothels, populated by state politicians from Albany and other criminals like the colorful gangster Legs Diamond and his wife Alice Kenny Diamond and his girlfriend, a former Ziegfeld Follies dancer, Marion Kiki Roberts. Hannah and her brood settled in Troy. They're all in the 1900 census, but by 1910 they had vanished. There's no mention of Hannah. I assume she died. Nor can I find any of the other Carneys except for Daniel. Family stories about his early age are vague. Some say his father, my great-grandfather, was accused of murder and fled north. But whether this happened in Ireland or in Troy or at all, no one is certain. There is more agreement that after his mother died, he was an orphan and moved into the local firehouse. This would have been sometime between when he was 11 and the time in this photo. Daniel looks prosperous in the photo, well-dressed and groomed, decked out like the other men with their ornate badges of honor. It was around this time that he made one of his two big decisions that served his family well. He became a plumber. Now, I can find little about what plumbers did before 1910, but tons on what they did after it. Because with the arrival of electricity, which could run water pumps, indoor plumbing became first an option and then very quickly a necessity throughout the country. And to an immigrant, installing all that shining steel and white porcelain, it must have felt like God's own work. The other major decision Daniel made was to use some of the money he was accumulating to buy a two-family house on 5th Avenue in Troy, right down the street from the Grand St. Patrick's Church. His family would live on one floor and rent out the other. He married Veronica Kenny and had a son in 1916, a daughter in 1918, and another daughter, my mother Helen, in 1919. This led into the Roaring '20s. Troy was still a prosperous place, and with much social activity, especially when Prohibition started. Liquor down from Canada came through Troy, as did liquor up from New York. It was a challenging time to raise a family, but that's what Daniel did. By all reports, he was a very strict parent, sensing and trying to save his family from the many threats he foresaw. In these matters, he was not always successful. Over time, Daniel became an officer in his union, which seamlessly led him into politics. This photo is probably from the early 40s. You can see how dressed up Dan is, the sharpest dresser in the group. Notice that by this point, the idiom for the photos was to smile, unlike the earlier photo, which says a lot about our culture. And just like the other photo, this is an all-male photo, which I fear also says much about us. I found an article on the front page of the New York Times in 1904 about Troy's politics. Admittedly, this was when Dan was still a boy of 15, but he was probably already in the firehouse, and perhaps even at this particular city council meeting. The Times said the place was packed. As soon as the council president called the meeting to order, the mayor and his brother, the chief of police, pulled out billy clubs and beat Doherty senseless. Police stationed throughout the crowd kept others from intervening, until Doherty's Democrats made a concerted effort to battle their way to the president and get him off to the hospital. Now, that is truly brass-knuckle politics. When the Depression hit, I bet it was the rent from the second floor of his home on 5th Avenue that kept his family afloat. Next came the Second War, during which Daniel got his son educated and his daughters married to educated men, which may seem like a trifling now, but was hugely important then. It maintained the upward trajectory of the family, which Daniel would have felt was his duty. He lived to see all of his 8 grandchildren begin middle-class lives so distant from where Daniel began in Ireland, or even from his early Troy roots with a 40-year-old single mother trying to establish a household of 9. In the 50s, my grandfather was in his 60s. The times were dominated by perky suburbs with fast food and TVs and record players and air-conditioned everything. All these additions to modern-day life began to accumulate around Daniel, and I think that is when he started to sink, feeling more and more like a stranger in a strange land. Feelings I too am experiencing as I now plow through my own 60s with iPads and pods and phones that are no longer phones and are much smarter than I will ever be. My grandfather's family had prospered due in part to his hard work and smart choices, but now he had won, and nothing is sadder than a fighter with nothing left to fight for. And besides, ultimately the bill always comes due for hard physical labor. Plumbing is brutal. It grounds you in the physical and then exhausts you in the physical. My sisters, who are younger, remember Daniel differently. They recall him as scary, stalking around in a drunken stupor, yelling at our grandmother, Veronica, and urinating all over the bathroom floor. I remember some of that, but it seemed the exception. To me, as Daniel aged, he seemed more confused and diminished. This strong patriarch becoming a slow-moving, toothless tiger. And then, in 1965, he died. He had pneumonia, followed by a heart attack. Veronica had died 2 years earlier. I want to end with 2 stories, one real, one imagined. My son is 21. He's geared toward the future. So when I tried to interest him in his great-grandfather, he was polite, but not much more. I showed him this photo and asked him to pick out who he thought Daniel Carney Sr. was. As a joke, he pointed to the balding man in the second row. Then I asked him where he would be if he were in this photo. He smartly replied, "In the first row." And I pressed, "Where in the first row?" He pointed to the middle. And of course, that's exactly where his great-grandfather was. The other story is more a rumination, a fantasy. Look closely behind the third row of men. Do you see that? The little people? Are they ghosts? No, they're kids. In fact, one of them looks like a girl. Did they run in at the last minute? Did that girl with a big grin delight in subverting this male moment? All the men standing so stiff and serious with their oversized badges. And her dashing in, smiling, and then probably dashing off. The men wouldn't have been happy with her intrusion. What became of her? Did she go through the roaring 20s as a gangster moll, or an interpretative dancer, or a suffragette, or all of these? Did my grandfather know her, or her family? How did the vibrations she stirred in the world impact him, and therefore impact me? Is the kind of question that has occurred to me so many times during my research. As I gain a firmer grasp of my own roots, I better appreciate the mesh of our shared roots.